in the end, it's just really about relationships.
Right.
And relationship with ourself and our body is primary
Mm.
for us to be able to connect with other people.
Welcome to your Journey to Joy podcast. I'm your host, Moyra Gorski, and I'm on a mission to help you find joy in the chaos of life. As a retired nurse, multi-passionate entrepreneur, and mom of 4 adult children, I know what it's like to feel the overwhelm of it all and wonder if and when the joy will show up again. And I've learned it's up to us to go find that joy. On this show, you will hear inspiring stories from those who have overcome all kinds of life challenges, tips on how to stay healthy and vibrant during the ups and downs of life, and simple ways on finding joy in your own life. Let's face it, life is messy, yet when we travel together on this journey, support and encourage each other along the way, that joy starts to show up again. I'm so excited to lead you on this journey of you to find the joyful life that you deserve. Well, welcome to another episode of this podcast. I'm your host, Moyra Gorski, and this podcast is your journey to joy. And it started out, we talk a lot about joy these days, but it started out by having conversations about eating disorders and overcoming addictions and resiliency in that. And so today we're going a little bit back there, if you will. Today I have a wonderful guest here, Dr. Kari Anderson, who's been an eating disorder specialist for many, many years, upwards to 30 plus years. And so although this will not air this week is Eating Disorder Awareness Week. And regardless of where my podcast goes to, there always continues to be awareness of eating disorders. And so I'm just really thrilled that you have said yes to join me today, Kari, and looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'd been following you on LinkedIn and so glad that we were able to connect.
Yes. Thank you. So let's start, as I always do, just start at the beginning or start with how you found your way to the work that you're doing. Why you're doing what you're doing, because it always starts somewhere with a story.
Right. Well, it's a personal passion. I, as a teenager in the late 70s, had what we now know to be binge eating disorder, but I thought that I was just a failed dieter, right? And felt out of control. I called myself one hot mess. And yet later when I learned, well, actually it wasn't until 2013 that they recognize binge eating disorder as a standalone eating disorder instead of grouped in kind of not otherwise specified. But when I recognized that, even as an eating disorder therapist, it really touched me to know that other people, in fact, most eating disorders are in this category. It's the most common eating disorder. And so when I realized that it was really touching and it meant a lot to me. And so my passion really has been driven by especially helping those with binge eating disorder. Although, of course, my working with eating disorders spans 30 some years. And so I've worked extensively in the residential treatment centers, and I've been working with outpatient in my own private practice for about the last 10 years. So it really is a personal passion. So,
Yeah. Well, and that's the way, with so many of the people that I've interviewed, that's really the way it started. They went through something themselves, and because of what they learned, they really want to help others because you have that personal connection with, perhaps what they're going, what they're going through for sure. And, as I mentioned to you before, our daughter went through, and I went through anorexia myself. So more restrictive eating as opposed to binging. So is there, it just came up just thinking, and I guess maybe we should just explain, what's the difference there for people that don't know. What's the difference between, because I think there's even there's so many eating disorders, and so there's even different forms of binge eating disorders, correct? Yeah.
Well, right. And it's interesting because, there was some debate as to whether or not binge eating disorder actually belonged in eating disorders. There was some debate as to whether it was a substance use disorder, an addiction. And of course, that's very controversial. It brings up a lot of feelings for people. whether or not, and yet in the end, it did fall into eating and feeding disorders. And the reason why it's more like an eating disorder than it is an addiction. But there are addictive characteristics to binge eating disorder. In fact, I would say about a third of those that I work with binge eating disorder would also endorse food addiction, because there is some brains that behave like that with food. But we're going to talk about it in terms of an eating disorder in the sense that there's always a drive for thinness. There's a thread of a drive for thinness and a body-based type of element to it. And so even those, what we call loss of control disorders, which would be with bulimia or binge eating, the drive is to actually be thinner. And yet the result of this drive for thinness is that there's this counteraction of the overeating. And that really is a neurological, biological basis to that. And that's a survival mechanism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so oftentimes there are some brains that with restrictive disorders, especially when the weight falls to a lower level, that there's a protective kind of a shutdown mechanism that occurs, and that's why anorexia is also a brain disorder, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's just the brain does different things when the restrictive behavior occurs and the weight goes down. And so one will overcorrect and one will shut down. And so they're very similar in the end game, right?
Right.
We want to that
Yeah.
piece, and that's why binge eating disorder actually ended up in as an eating disorder in terms of the diagnostic criteria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's all interesting because again, they're going for the same thing, but their behaviors are different. And people probably think binging, well, that means they're purging. Well, not all the time, right? There's the purging and all of that. So, but what regardless of the behavior, what fascinates me and what I want to talk about today too is just, again, what's behind all of that? Like, why are people engaging in that? And, even with my own experience and with our family and seeing others, and there's a girl at our gym who is clearly has an issue. She's not just thin. She's not just very ill. I mean, she's thin and ill. And my heart breaks for her every time I see her there for hours on end at the gym. But I say that because we were like, oh, we know who the anorexics are because we can see it. But I've had others make a comment like they have an eating disorder. And I've even interviewed people who are overweight. And they're like, well, yes, I have an eating disorder. And people don't always think that. They're like, you can visually see those anorexics because of their size, but often you can't see it with those.
And that's the thing with eating disorders, is that you can't tell someone has an eating disorder by looking at them. And I think that's the biggest misunderstanding. There's a lot of people that have eating disorders that you would never know that they do, that they're really suffering in silence, that it isn't visible from the outside. But on the two ends of the spectrum, if you look at the continuum, you've got the very, very thin, and then we have the very, very large-bodied individuals as well. And that's just a symptom.
Right.
That's not the problem.
Right. Yeah. The problem is,
so we're just looking at symptoms. And unfortunately, those people with binge eating disorder end up in weight loss centers and clinics and being treated by for medical weight loss or bariatric, or now with the semaglutide medications and whatnot, because still they're looking at the symptom and saying, okay, this person has become overweight or obese and we're going to treat that. But they're just treating a symptom. They're not really looking at what's causing that. So that's really misunderstood as well.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. So a lot of your work has been done with this polyvagal brain and, things like that. So let's start by discussing that and talking about that. Okay. We want to talk about well, as you said earlier, before we went on, it's going to go into attachments and food and things like that. And like I said earlier, I just got back from a couple of weeks ago talking at a modern entrepreneur program. We were talking about attachment styles and relationships and enmeshments and all of that. Again, it's fascinating to me. So I love the fact that we're going to talk about that today.
Right.
So yeah, if you could, talk about that polyvagal and what that all means.
Well, I have to say that the polyvagal theory that has been discovered by Dr. Stephen Porges years and years ago, but when I was introduced to it, it's been over 10 years now that I was introduced to it, and through the lens of eating issues. I think that it really changed everything about how I approach my work. Very much when I first started doing work in this field, we used to treat eating disorders, 35 years ago as an addiction. Okay. Which was interesting because now I've kind of come back and really looking at the addictive aspect of it. But then we moved into the cognitive behavioral aspect. And that's really the most evidence-based, treatment today in terms of for eating disorders is coming from a cognitive behavioral. But I've become a body-based therapist in the last 10 years because things just really kind of became very clear to me when I go. In fact, it changed the way I looked at why I had an eating disorder when I was young. I go, oh, it's like everything kind of, the clouds part and you go,
right.
Oh, it's like after 20 years in this business, I get it now. And it really comes down to this idea of attachment. And so the idea with polyvagal theory is that one, it's a biological imperative that we are connected to other mammals or people, right? To regulate our nervous system, that it's a built-in that we need to be in relationship. And when we are in relationship and co-regulate each other's nervous systems by simply being safe and being around them. And so what happens is there's a breach in that attachment. That this theory would be is that instead of being driven toward connection, this nervous system in a person would be driven toward protecting ourselves because it's not safe to be you're not bonded and the environment that you're in, it's not safe to connect because of some sort of breach. Now it could be just purely a biological, very sensitive nervous system. People, it can be epigenetic and be passed down, right? We know that what's happened to our ancestors in terms of a traumatic history, whether it be the Holocaust or the potato famine or whatever, it's interesting that those types of protections are passed down in our nervous system. So the idea would be with eating behavior and the polyvagal is that one takes this protective stance and actually uses food to mimic or to replace the connection with people. So we become actually attached to food as our co-regulator, as our primary attachment. And interestingly, from a nervous system perspective, the neural pathways that are used through ingestion, so the sensory experience of eating, chewing, swallowing, and whatnot, uses the very same pathways as we use when we're socializing face-to-face with individuals. And so it's a very clear, especially from a survival perspective, is that food, it means I'm safe, I'm going to be okay. From a biological survival of the fittest perspective. So food is safety, and then food becomes the co-regulator of our nervous system. And interestingly, is the more attached somebody comes to food as their regulator, the more isolating and less socializing they are, right? And we know that, especially with all eating disorders, as that when the eating disorder takes over as the regulator, as whether it be not eating or whether it be overeating, then what happens is they become more and more isolative and pushing people out. And so the treatment then is to become more safe, right, in a co-regulatory process with people, but also to learning to regulate our own nervous system in ways of befriending the nervous system and learning to calm the nervous system and have an influence over it. And so it would be not uncommon that people have also anxiety disorders, because oftentimes they've even thought that eating disorders are a form of an anxiety disorder. Right. So,
well, I'm just going to tell you that my clouds just parted a little bit wider right now. So, I mean, seriously, because I'm like, okay, it just so much makes sense. And again, and for me, it's making more sense because of the work that I've been doing with myself and this idea of, and we'll get to that in a second with regulating our own nervous systems. But so I can understand it in what you're saying from, like, again, if we're not feeling loved by someone, then we're going to just take that food, and the food is love. So we're just going to eat the food. Right. But I would also venture to say, because I've seen it in my own life and in my own environment, when we're feeling like we're not being seen or attached, and there isn't love there, or we don't feel worthy of that love, or they're shutting us out, then we're just going to shut ourselves out of that, meaning we're not going to eat. Right.
Yeah, and it's just protective.
It's protecting.
You know, if we look through everything through the lens of fear or not fear, I always say, like with my memoir and my books, it's food, body, and love. And love is a state, the way that I look at love, it's a state of without fear. Right. So we're either fearful or we're attached, and from a love perspective. And even the hormones that we have in our body that regulate all this is oxytocin, is of course the hormone that's expressed with love. And then the stress hormones like cortisol is when we're fearful. And so just the regulation of balancing those things in our body. So this is not just an emotional disorder, it's also a chemical and neurochemical biological process.
And in addition to that, it's not just, okay, well, you're not eating, so why don't you just eat? Or you're eating too much, eat less, right? The food is not the solving of the issue, right? It's how about we look at your relationships and let's work on family therapy or friend therapy or whatever, which again, having years of experience with our daughter in treatment programs, that part I believe is very lacking, is that, they do all the CBT and ACT and all of that stuff in the place, but do they bring the family in? And do they really identify those relationships that are perhaps, not going well or haven't gone well? I know it wasn't done so much. And
exactly. And you need to be able, in order to recover, you need to be able to feel safe.
Right.
So how do you create safety? And that's the number one thing that all therapists should be looking through that lens of safety. Is this person safe? Are we creating safe environments for this person so that they can let their guard down? Because even if they're getting all this ACT, CT, CBT, DBT, all the alphabet soups, you can't access those skills unless your brain allows that, and you're not in a protective state, you're in a state of receiving, connecting. And so you can get all this therapy you want, but if you're not in a safe environment, you're not going to be able to use those skills.
Yeah. And then what I've been working with and introduced to about a year and a half or so ago was hypnobreathwork. And hypnobreathwork is a way to, I was introduced to it by a gal who I met through LinkedIn, who found that she was, in her business, and her dynamic growth of her business was so dysregulated. And she was introduced to sound meditation and hypnobreathwork as a form of, again, self-regulating. And so, again, I love that you said that, because there is this, yes, working through your relationships, but we have to figure out how to say, for instance, that person isn't going to change that we're in relationship with. How are we going to feel safe? And so we can wait for them to change, or we can do something ourselves. And that's what I found is so empowering with this hypnobreath work for myself and for all those that have been, that I've seen and learned from, is that it's a way that I can self-regulate.
Yeah. And so the first relationship is being safe with yourself. Now that kind of intersects with eating disorders as well, because if there's such a body disconnection and self and hatred, how are you going to be able to connect and listen to your body in terms of what kind of state it's in? And so many people are kind of numb to their body. So mindfulness, right, is and body mindfulness and what I call neutrality, or instead of looking at the body as an object in terms of its size, but looking at it as a place that we live and be listening to the feedback that our body gives us, we can tell whether we're in a protective state or we're in a safer or connected state. And even though it's an autonomic nervous system, learning that we actually have been given this beautiful gift of being able to shift our own nervous states through our breath, that was built into us. And so being able to use our breath work as the primary, and also then learning that all from a sensory perspective, we can influence our nervous system through all of our senses, because it's very powerful in that it's all connected to the vagus nerve, all our sensory nervous system. So for instance, that's where, for instance, cold. Now it's a big deal right now. Everybody's cold plunging. Like here in Arizona, everybody's plunging into their pools in the backyard because they're cold now. They're not heating their pools.
Right.
So people are cold plunging. And everybody's like, oh, wow, this is so great. Well, it's nervous system regulating, right? It calms the nervous system right down when you use cold. Well, you don't have to be plunging into the pools. You can just get a cold washcloth and put it on your neck, and it'll do the same thing. But anyway, so
no, but that's good because you just saved people money, because they've been, I mean, it's all over Instagram, these people that are, jumping into these pools or having these pools on their back porch, and Mel Robbins goes in there and all these people. And it's like, I can't hardly turn the shower to cold before I get out. But, you can do it very simply like that, or put a cold wash rag.
Because we've been doing that for years, in the therapy world, in terms of it's basically stimulating the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve runs down the neck. And so you can put a cold compress on the vagus nerve and it'll calm things down. So I'm not saying that they shouldn't do these cold plunging, because it's if that's their thing, they can do that. But there are other ways. But it's the same thing with a sensory in terms of sense and music therapy, and anything that you can actually change the nervous system through using your senses to do that. But of course, breath work is the gold stuff for regulating the nervous system. It's built right into the diaphragm.
Yeah. And it's been fascinating for me. And again, came back a couple weeks ago from a place that we did, 3 really powerful breathwork meditations over a day and a half. And, one of them was talking about these, emotionally charged relationships, and in a positive way and a negative way. And again, I've done some podcasts on hypnobreathwork, so this isn't a time to talk about all of that, but it's really, again, another fascinating time for me, that some things came up that I heard, saw, experienced about relationships with my husband, most specifically, that I just never, I kind of thought it was this way. And there was this other realization, like, wow, and I think I need to go and do some apologies and do some talking about things with him. And because of what came up in this breathwork meditation was just, I don't know, it was fascinating, and not at all what I expected,
Right. And, everybody has their protections, and some people are fighters and some people are runners, right? Some people withdraw. And so when you understand that these are just protective behaviors, and think about it from a sympathetic nervous system, it's either a fight flight. And we've got different behaviors that we do when we feel threatened. And it's really, a lot of times, it's not anything about the person,
no,
the other people.
Well, yeah. And I think that, you said something about ancestors as we were first starting to talk. That, again, as I went through this breathwork meditation, and hope people can hear is that it's not always, again, like, why am I acting this way? Well, look back on how you were raised. And that was a big realization for me as I saw how I, how for some reason, after a while, I kind of didn't know how to really ask for help. I didn't really know how to talk about the difficult things that were going on with me and the struggles that I was having. So I got quiet. And I'm not sure my mother knew how to. I mean, when I look at how she was raised and the different things she went through, she kind of got quiet in her high school years. Well, so that was modeled for me. And then I, was in a marriage, and then we had stressful things, and we were raising kids and a daughter with an eating disorder and all this. And like, I did not ask for help. So I shut down. I was quiet. I just did the thing because I get it all done. Right. And so, and again, that doesn't have anything to do with anybody that's in my life. It has to do with what I was modeled and then what I learned. And then, so it gave me a chance to really see that and say, yeah, my husband still has this, or this person still has this, but what can I do? I can say, hey, listen, you know what? I can sit and blame you for not meeting my needs, but I didn't really know how to talk about them. I didn't really know how to open up and say, I need some help here. I'm drowning. What's going on? I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know how to do that back then in high school. I went to college and developed an eating disorder. I didn't know how to talk to my mother, and then, so again, I think that's the cool work that we can do. And I believe that's what you're involved with too, is that you're helping people see that. So what can we do ourselves? And again, that has nothing to do with my husband.
Right.
And it really has everything to do with what I've learned and how I protected myself over the years.
Exactly.
And so I can continue on with that. Or as I always say to myself, what am I committed to changing so that I don't continue, so that I'm in a healthier, I think you said something earlier, not healthier, but, just in a more cohesive type of relationship, perhaps, or one that you're not fighting so much. Brought to you by Gorski Wellness and the possibility of a better you. Are you feeling sluggish? Ready for a change? Need more energy? Up for a bigger challenge? I'm Moyra Gorski, retired nurse and wellness advocate. For over 22 years, I've been helping people live healthier lives while making small changes each and every day. Those small changes lead my clients to living a healthier lifestyle with markedly better health. As a brand ambassador for the Shaklee Corporation, the most clinically proven wellness company in the world, I guide my clients to make healthier choices each day with their food, supplements, skincare, workouts, and mindset. They say getting started is half the battle. Let's make healthy happen together. If you're ready for simple, natural, sustainable solutions to feeling and looking your best, let's connect. You'll find a link in the show notes or reach out to me at moyragorski.com. Here's to a better you.
And being aware of your own protective style and what makes you feel safe, it's learning to be able to educate others. First, educate yourself and understanding yourself, right? And then being able to communicate that to others and say, hey, I just want to let you know what I've learned about myself. It's interesting is that when this happens, I tend to do this, and I'm really trying to work against that. But this really isn't. It's more about me trying to create safety for myself. And it maybe it's not what it appears to be, in terms of I may appear to be cold, right? Or to push you away. And yet there's a whole process going on in here that I'm just trying to stay safe. And so when we start to talk about these things and educate other people in terms of what I've learned about myself, it really opens up the dialogue that about this is my nervous system. And from a polyvagal perspective, our autonomic nervous system is not in our conscious control, right? We may react in a protective stance, and that's just biological. It's like, it's not an affront to somebody else, right? When somebody, for instance, when somebody freezes, right, and they can't speak, they don't fight back or whatnot. Well, years ago, it would be, well, you must have liked that. Like, I'm thinking of somebody that's been sexually assaulted. Like, well, why didn't you cry out? Or why didn't you fight back? Or what? Well, I was like in a state of frozen, right? I could not, and that was my body reacting. This was not this was not, if I thought I could, I would.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we realize is that the body does what it's going to do to protect itself. It's not always a decision.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so as we educate people about that, I think they start to understand more that we are beings and live in a body, right? And we don't necessarily, we can understand it. We can work on having influence and shifting our nervous system. But for the most part, right, it may, we call that biological rudeness.
Mm.
This idea is that that's not really in our control. A lot of things that, we look at the neurodiverse and we are, it's socially, they don't act socially appropriate at times, right? Well, it's because they're in a heightened state of fear and protection. And so therefore, it's like they don't look at you in the eye, right? They divert themselves. They might even do something like look away and put their hands on their ears. Well, they're overstimulated, right? They're not trying to, push you away. Like my child doesn't hug me, right? And what's wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with you. Your child just does not feel safe. And so that's a protective. So when we start to look at these through the lens of fear and safety,
right,
everything looks a little bit different.
Yeah. And I just got off a call with some girlfriends that I had met at that North Carolina, and I won't divulge too much, but one was talking about, again, this stuff that's coming up that with her breath work and that stuff that we're being asked to do. And she's like, I don't know what to do. And I just kept hearing in my head, there's so much fear there of, she's in this state of fear that she doesn't know how the other person's going to react. She doesn't know what this means. I believe she is in that state of fear. And so she's just doing nothing. She's like, I don't know what to do because she's so stopped.
Yeah.
Because she's afraid
we shut down
because we do that.
We're either in a fight, flight, sympathetic, or we're in a collapse and drop state. And that's what they call the dorsal vagal aspect, is that sometimes we just become immobile. And so it's just another way of protection. When we become overwhelmed with the sympathetic or, the fight, flight, that one of the natural things for us is to go more primitive, right? And to be like, the frog stuck in the mud that looks like it's dead, right? Plain dead. And so we have those primitive features as when we can't fight off or to run, we collapse and freeze.
Yeah. So you've talked a little bit about, mindfulness and breath work. So, and again, we've learned so much here. Like, what are some things that, again, I think that obviously you're working in the eating disorder world and you're helping people there. But I think that what I found too with my podcast is many of the listeners, they don't have an eating disorder, but they could really relate to what you're saying. And I certainly can relate to it. So let's talk about some things that people can do that are helpful once we realize what's going on. What are things that we can do to feel safer or help with those relationships or self-regulate or those type of, let's talk about that.
Yeah. I also use internal family systems therapy. Okay. And it's a very compassionate based therapy, meaning that we don't judge that, the way that we respond or the things that we think are bad, right? We go, there's a reason why, there's a protective reason why we do that. And so what I have learned is that it's kindness that creates change. When we are challenged, we then get into, again, a more protective state. And so here's just an example of how we can adopt this in our own relationship with self. But for instance, in a challenging argument with another individual, and everybody, they're in their stances. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. Right. And we get into these standoffs and whatnot, and we're judging and we're not being flexible. We know that in those type of situations, all it takes is one person to say, you're right. Meaning they could be a tiny fraction right, but at least there's a part that they're right.
Hmm.
People love to hear, to be validated, and
Right.
to hear you're right. It all the defenses start to relax. We're not protecting anymore. It's like, okay, I feel understood. And now they're open to listen to me, right? And so just that technique, what about using that with yourself? So many people have this ongoing critical dialogue in their head, and they're criticizing themselves, and they're thinking that somehow that's going to motivate them, right? Come on. I can't believe you're doing that. It's like they kind of internalize that critical parent.
Hmm.
Well, compassion therapy and being compassionate toward ourselves actually frees us up to not be defensive and to feel safe enough to be able to mobilize change. And so I think that learning how to dialogue with ourselves with compassion, as if talking to these different parts of ourselves, how would we, if we had a child, right? Would
Hmm.
we be, come on, get over it? Stop doing that. You're stupid. Does that make this person feel safe? Is that how you might parent a good friend or a child? No, that's not. So learning how to dialogue with self in a compassionate way and say, I really understand. Like, even if we look at the eating disorder behavior, or you take any other behavior and you say, I get it. One of my sayings is, I've never met anybody that didn't have a really good reason for an eating disorder. And they go, what do you mean by that? And I go, everybody has a good reason for
Hmm.
their protection, right? And they needed it. And so, some of the clients that I have, they might say something like, I don't hate my eating disorder because I can remember a time where my choice was, I'm either going to eat this large pizza or I'm going to kill myself. And I'm glad I ate the large pizza, right? And
Hmm.
so we do what we have to do to survive. And sometimes these protective behaviors, or these things that seem so damaging to ourselves at the time, it's the right choice.
Hmm.
Okay. And so if we can have compassion toward people, as I get it, and validate as to why we do these things that we might end up hating, or that seems to be counterproductive, if we can meet that with some compassion, it really allows us to let our guard down
Hmm.
and to feel safe enough to explore and experiment and make some change. And so that's what I would say. If somebody is struggling with something, if you can start to adopt some self-compassion and some giving yourself some grace, and saying, oh, I get why I do that, and not to come from such a critical perspective, I think that you'll find that it'll free you up to be able to make the changes that you need.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yep, that was perfectly said. Somebody, what's that? What's the movie that has all of the different characters? It's almost like a
Inside Out.
Inside Out. Yeah.
Yeah,
I've been told by a few people, just go watch that movie again because
right.
it's that idea of all of those
All
internal
these
family
parts.
systems, all the parts
Mhm.
that we have
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
ourselves. And I like that what you said, like, are you speaking to yourself like what if you were speaking to a child like that? Would that
Hmm.
work for them? It's probably not going to
Yeah.
work for you. And I believe that if we can start with ourselves,
Hmm.
because people say, well, what am I supposed to say to my husband? What am I supposed to say to my daughter? What am I? Well, if we can start with ourselves.
Right. Yeah, that's a perfect thing to say, because we have to be able to have a great relationship with ourselves before we can model to other people, right? I mean,
Hmm.
if we're speaking so terrible to ourselves, how are we going to know, right, how to speak to somebody else? So that it does start with us.
Hmm.
That's the best place uh, to start. One of the things that with the polyvagal theory, one of the things that we do is learn to befriend our nervous system. And so many people actually, especially with when anxiety comes up, it's very, very uncomfortable. And people tend to, what I call, fear their fear. So when I experience fear coming up, then I get afraid, right? Oh no, oh no, I'm getting in a panic, or oh no, my heart's racing or whatever. And so then it just perpetuates, fear perpetuates more fear. And one of the things that we learn to do is to not look at fear from a perspective of, oh, this is a bad thing. Because all of the things that our nervous system does, right, is there in the service of survival.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea would be to kind of place our hands, right, and to calm and nurture on ourselves and go, oh, thank you. Thank you for warning me, right? You're doing your job. Something's up. You're protecting me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for doing that. I think we're okay. Let's calm down, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not let's calm down.
Right. You got to calm down.
In
Right.
terms of the threat, but let's just start to breathe. Maybe let's go for a walk. Let's clear our head. I'll help you calm down.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's actually a relationship with our autonomic nervous system, right? And thanking it for doing its job rather than looking at it when we get anxious or nervous as a threat. Right.
I love that.
So,
love that. Yeah. Again, we're talking about eating disorders, and I always come back to myself. Again, I think you're aware of this, and my listeners are too. I mean, I had a, breast cancer diagnosis at the beginning of October. And so I've been really, now on this little different path of learning more about the things that are impacting me, and this stress and all this nervous system. I mean, I'm much more aware of that. And I love that because that's what I'm going to just remember that and do that a little bit more. Cause that's what I'm noticing. I'm like, when something happens or somebody says something, I'm like, wow, I really am feeling that in my body. And so I'm working to be more aware of that so that then I can say, okay, just like you said, I think it's time to go for a walk, or maybe it's time to look at this differently, or whatever the case is. But being aware of that. And I love that, like, okay, thanks for letting me know that things are a little, that I've got the fear or whatever it is, because again, it can help with eating disorders. It can help with just everything
it's just life, right?
It's life,
living,
right?
It's living in our body and being connected to other people. And that's what life's all about, right? Is our connections in the end, right?
In the end, right.
In the end, it's just really about relationships,
right?
And relationship with ourself and our body is primary for us to be able to connect with other people. So that's why the disconnection to self and the disconnection to our own bodies gets us so dysregulated.
Right.
So anyway, so I just think that when it comes to illness, and I really look at fear from a real primary level. For instance, even when the body is in a state of fear, right? I will even look at the level of inflammation. So if I look, most disease is a result of the body getting inflamed in some area or whatnot. And we know that metabolic health is a huge issue right now, and we're learning so much about that. And yet, if we look at that as inflammation is just a protection, it's like something's wrong, something's up. Right. I'm going to have to protect it through this inflammatory process. And so if we look at it as like, oh, the body's just trying to protect itself here, what can I do to help calm the body? And I just believe so much in the power of kindness and the power of our mental manifestations and things like that in terms of really making every cell. I have some meditations in my workbook and whatnot of actually meditating that my cells are feeling safe down to the cellular level, right? It's like you're going to be okay. You're loved. I'm manifesting love. I'm calming ourselves. And so when the body's ill, it's like trying to make the body feel safe, even at the cellular level, I think is key in terms of us trying to heal. And so that sounds a little ooh-ah and, fuzzy, but I just think there's a lot of powerful things that can happen when we start being kinder.
Right. Well, I think it may sound a little fuzzy for some, but I mean, I believe that is exactly, you said it a beautiful way. That's exactly why when people say, I decided to calm down and I decided to not let things bother me and I did meditation, I was at peace and I healed. I mean, I'm reading spontaneous, books about radical remission.
Right.
And that's why it happens. We can do all these things with food and supplements and medications, but you can also do it in mindfulness. And that's exactly, I believe, you said it beautifully. Like, if we can help ourselves feel safe all the way down to the cellular level, then our body's going to act in a very nice, calm, because they feel safe. I mean,
and our body wants to heal. Our body wants to heal itself. Its entire job is to protect and to heal. And so the more that we can help it to feel safe, right, and manifest safety, it can then do its job, because it's either on alert and it's protecting, or it's calm, it's in its circadian rhythm and all the boxes are being checked and it's healing, right? And so I don't want to throw it off so that it's always in a protective mode, because then it's not healing when it's trying to be protective. So anyway, that's just a conceptualization that I keep in my mind.
It's a good one. It's a good one. And how can people, because you said workbook, how can people get more of you and learn more about you? Because I know you have a book. Is the book much more of a workbook style, or do you have a workbook in addition to the Food, Body, and Love?
Yeah, I've got two. The first book that I wrote was 13 years ago, I wrote a book with Dr. Michelle May on mindful eating for binge eating. But then after I wrote a book about that, and it's a memoir, and it's food. So that came out in 21, Food, Body, and Love. But the greatest of these is love. And it's a mixture of a memoir and a self-help and an education on this whole neurological, biological approach to eating disorders. And it's about the contrasting protection and fear versus love and connection. Okay. And then the workbook came out last year, and it's really it's just the Food, Body, and Love Companion Workbook. And it's operationalized everything from it's 8 sessions that it takes people through, and from meditation solutions to, there is some cognitive behavioral therapy, but there's a lot of internal family systems and healing, and just some activities that you can do that are really practical. And it's just full of that. And it's become a very popular workbook, especially not only with people that I work with, but with clinicians using it with their clients. And you can find those books through Amazon. I don't sell them on my website. I just send them to Amazon, let Amazon take care of it.
Right.
But you can search me on Amazon, Dr. Kari Anderson, Kari, or search Food, Body, and Love, and it'll come up. In terms of finding me, and I do consulting, coaching. I still do counseling in the states that I'm licensed. I'm licensed in Arizona, Washington State, and Vermont. And you can find me at my URL, which is myeatingdoctor.com. So MYEATING, and spelled out doctor, DOCTOR.com. So My Eating Doctor. And so I'm pretty easy to find. Those are kind of memorable. My Eating Doctor or Food, Body, and Love.
Yeah, that's really good. Really great conversation. I really loved it. And I really appreciate you being here today. As I offer up to all my clients or my guests, any last words that you just want to share with the audience today as we finish this up?
I would just say, just to think kindness, right? I mean, if we could just source kindness and love and be intentional about that, and try to create safety in our lives and make the world a safer place for everybody else. If we were to go into every interaction and say, how can I make this interaction? How can I create safety for this interaction? How can I make this person feel safe? Think about what a better world it would be, right? That we think of safety first, because we tend to be our own fear and our protections create strife and division. And we are such a polarized and divisive world, especially on social media.
Yep.
And so, but just to think about how we could actually change at least our influence on the world if we tried to create safety.
Yep. It's really good. Really good. Thank you, Kari, for being here. I really appreciate it. And I know my audience has gotten a lot out of it, as I have as well. I really appreciate your openness and this great discussion. So thanks again. And again, thanks,
Thank
audience.
you.
Thanks. You're welcome. Thanks for being here, my audience. And catch you next time on another great conversation that I have or a solo episode. But again, be kind to yourself, and we can spread kindness to the world, because as I wrote down, kindness certainly can create change. And that's what it's all about. Yeah. Thank you. Hey there, ready to live a more joyful life? Considering connecting with someone who can help you? If so, I'd like to be that person. I offer a free consultation where we determine where the chaos is in your life and how you can learn to bring more joy each and every day. Visit my website, MoyraGorski.com, or simply email me, Moyra@MoyraGorski.com, with more joy in the subject line. I look forward to connecting, and I'm here to say there will always be some chaos, which requires a little juggling, but you can find joy and live your life intentionally filled with that joy. Let me help you on your journey to joy, and that's joy, the journey of you.